thank you for joining. There's a lot on the calendar today. There's stuff I wanted to go to beyond this. And so I was like, I don't know how many people we'll have, but this is a great turnout. So thank you for coming. I'm glad you're here. This is departing from our general structure for Wednesday research seminars and lectures. This is not a research seminar. This is a facilitated discussion between Vincott and myself, two colleagues on faculty in the Department of Global Health, bringing a debate that we've had periodically play on the faculty forum listserv for a decade, eight or 9 years now, that comes up periodically when we think about religion or when religion shows up in the news and someone weighs in on it, into a discussion in a more public space around how do we think about the connections and intersections and influences between religion as a social force and its impact on public health practice and our emphasis in public health on scientific inquiry and scientific method to inform the work that we do. Vincott and I have various perspectives on that. Sometimes those perspectives align, sometimes those perspectives are pretty far off from one another. But I think we often learn from each other, both when we flame out an email response on the listserv, and then when we get together and actually have a more substantive conversation about this, sometimes over a beer, as we've done at Emory Point, and sometimes over a cup of coffee, as we've done at other times, and sometimes just running by each other's office. So hopefully that frame will take precedence today. Really quickly, just a little bit of background on both of us. I joined the faculty at Rollins in the fall of 2009, so I've been here for 15 years, which is hard to believe. Coming from the School of Theology before that, my background is in theological and religious studies, and I got into the field of public health working as a chaplain to people living with, and in the early 1990s when I was doing that work, regularly dying from HIV infection in an era of HIV monotherapy. So my background coming into both clinical medical spaces and the field of public health more broadly comes out of the religion and religious practice side. I also come as someone who expresses a faith perspective and is also pretty critical of the way that religion can function as an out gay man. And so in terms of my own experiences in relation to organized religion and religious structures, I kind of stand in this odd space of appreciating aspects of religion and having critiques of aspects of religion. And I think you'll see that as I talk today. Vincott comes into this space, and he said I could introduce him. So I may take, in taking liberties or the limits of my perspective, I may fail to say some things or I may mischaracterize some things, so you feel free to correct. He comes into this space as an intellectually curious skeptic. Would that be an accurate description? On all kinds of topics, but on religion in specifically, who also recognizes that religion has a profound kind of influence on social forces and social movements and social institutions. As someone coming from India, working often in India, and experiences that negotiation about religion's function, both in his own life and in the practice context of his global health work. Would that be an accurate description? All right. So today we are going to schedule this discussion with me giving a kind of statement on where I see religion and public health intersecting from a research and intellectual perspective, Vincott making a summary statement around his perspective, us kind of bringing in talking points together and noting points of agreement or disagreement, and then opening up that discussion to those of you in the audience. So, here's my statement. According to a large and influential group of social scientists, mostly out of Western contexts, religion will disappear as a significant human experience as technological advances based on scientific knowledge reveal to us the truth of our complex world. This is the perspective of, for example, a German philosopher named Jürgen Habermas, who says that religion occupies this kind of transitory moment of diminishing kind of importance as science and scientific knowledge take precedent. This is the main, if dangerously oversimplified, thesis of secularization theory, that we are moving towards secularization. I don't agree with this theory, and a lot of people who are prime proponents and articulators of that theory now have parted ways with it as well. I would argue that religious ways of understanding the world and that religious experience still retain significant force and will continue to do so in shaping the taken for granted ways that individuals, communities, societies, cultures, and nations make choices and set priorities. If I'm correct in my rejection of the inevitable march of secularization, that won't happen or is not happening, then it follows that our field of public health in general and global health specifically is spectacularly ill-equipped to engage with religion because of our intellectual tradition of valuing scientific knowledge and demonstrable evidence, and because the culture of secularism is so very powerful within Western liberal cultural frameworks, the very same frameworks that ground, in many ways, the field of public health and research and practice. Here are 4 points on which I argue that we have failed to understand religion. First, we endeavor to measure something that we awkwardly call religiosity in our field when we think about religion, and we do that according to quantifiable metrics most of the time, such as attendance in worship or self-reports of regular spiritual practices like prayer. And that tells us woefully too little, in my perspectives, about religion, leaving us naive, and I would say sometimes willfully so because we fail to think of new ways to interrogate religion in relation to its effects on our field. 2, we either begrudgingly tolerate religion or we zealously advocate for religion as a social force within the field. We may acknowledge that it has an impact, but we don't like that it has an impact, or we may argue that no one ever pays attention to religion, and by all means, pay attention to religion and work with religious actors and partners, and you'll solve all of the problems in relation to program implementation in community context. Each of these approaches is dangerously flawed, in my opinion, and they leave us ill-equipped to critique religion as a social force that has mixed, complex, and variable effects. We tend to see religion in an all-or-nothing framework, and its effects are quite varied and different. 3, we fail to understand the complex diversities within and across various religious traditions, and these complexities lead to organizational capacities to carry out an impressive number of services that have direct and indirect impacts on health outcomes, but because we don't understand that diversity from an organizational perspective, we don't really think about the impact of those services or the scale and the scope of them. And 4, we primarily focus on religion's influence in the social, cultural, and political mainstream. We work with actors and religious leaders in that mainstream, and we are all but oblivious to religious expressions on the social margins. These religious practices involve expressions of power and agency in relation to that marginalization. They can either rationalize marginalization as reflective of God's will, or they can be practices to resist social marginalization. Those of us in the field are inextricably wrapped up in such equations of agency and power between the mainstreams and the margins, and we may inadvertently, or sometimes intentionally, or knowingly, contribute to health vulnerabilities for socialized, marginalized groups when we try to amplify our public health agenda through the religious mainstream, and we fail to too often to acknowledge that and wrestle with the both and complexity of that. So those are my 4 kind of summary statements and main points where I see religion intersecting with our field. I'll turn it over to Venkat.
Thank you, John. John is a qualified theologian and a PhD in religion, so for me to take him on is difficult. However, thank you, John, for this opportunity. I don't have slides, but I'm going to make 4 statements, 4 points too, and I'm going to expand on those 4 points. My first point is that there is inherent differences in the philosophical structures of science and religion. That's the first point I want to establish with you. Secondly, I want to take you to thinking about we need clarity on what we mean by religion, especially when we are talking about a global context here. Number 2. And thirdly, I want to present to you certain historical challenges that religion has posed to science and health. And I want to use some examples, some historical, some very contemporary ones. And fourthly, I want to again join John in acknowledging that religion is a reality that we have to deal with. The question is, how might we harness it while we utilize it for positive good while mitigating its negative effects? That's going to be my 4 points. Firstly, when you think in terms of the philosophical structures of science and religion, they're both, in a sense, human inventions that seek to find the truth. That's what they are both about. But when you start looking at the structures, the philosophical structures, they can't be more different. Firstly, science is about accepting uncertainty and takes an agnostic position. Science is about knowing the knowable and being uncertain about the unknowable, whereas religion takes positions of certainty in general, number one. That is a big difference. So science is much more reactive to knowledge and curiosity. Religion tends to be more reactive to beliefs. That's where the two differences. Which means that the assumptions, both disciplines of assumptions, but the assumptions of science are arbitrary. When something changes, science is willing to change the assumptions, whereas religion tends to have absolute assumptions. Thirdly, science is about skepticism. It's about questioning, it's about not believing, whereas religion is about faith, it's about believing, it's about dogma. Number 4, science is about irreverence to authority. You don't accept authority, you might have mentors, but you don't accept authority, whereas religion promotes a sense of reverence to authority, a reverence to structure, a reverence to to all kinds of things. Fourthly, in terms of function, science is about expanding knowledge and curiosity. It's indifferent to how that knowledge is going to affect anything. It is indifferent. Whereas religion, by its very structure, even from the word religion, Gian and Ligia, is about unifying people. It's about bringing a large group of people together. That's what religion is about. And therefore, it also appeals to the idea of giving people a sense of purpose and meaning to life. So in a sense, it is a political construct. At that level, it's a political construct. So those are some of the major philosophical differences between science and religion. Now let me ask you the question, what do we exactly mean by religion? Especially in a global context. Firstly, when you think about it, like I said, a lot of, at the base level, at the most socio-cultural level, religion, in a sense, the way it is operated, it's about uniting people for a political purpose or for a political cause or to give meaning. And then there are different branches of religion. When we talk of religion, particularly in a country like the United States, a lot of the ideas come from the Abrahamic, faiths, particularly the construct, the Abrahamic context. And here again, this is where one of the conversations that John and I have had. But the moment you talk of religion, there's an automatic acceptance of the existence of God. And I want to challenge you on that because when you look around the world, the plethora of religions, particularly the vast heterodoxy of Indian religions and spiritual traditions, it's not necessary. In fact, at the foundation, the Vedic Indian religion takes a position of the ultimate reality is unknowable. It takes an agnostic position. There are verses in the Rig Veda which basically challenge the question that we know. It basically says we don't know. And then there are versions in 6 branches of the Hindu philosophy that are atheistic. 6 branches of atheistic Hindu philosophy that are atheistic. So atheism is not in contradiction with Hindu philosophy. Thirdly, there are branches of Hindu philosophy which are extremely theistic. And there are polyistic philosophies. There are animistic philosophies. So again, what exactly do we mean? Is it the presence of God or the absence of God? Is it a structure that unites people? Is it something that gives people purpose? I think we need greater clarity on that. And the other major problem of the roles of religions, especially when you examine its influence on health, examine its influence on politics, etc., there have been certain religions have a tendency to proselytization and conversion. I know the truth, I'm going to teach you the truth. Or worse still, I know the truth, I'm going to tolerate your truth. both of those are contentious positions. So essentially, when you look at the history of colonization, so Christianity in certain form was a tool to colonization in many parts of the world. It colonized and Christianized the whole of Africa. The whole of Latin America was Catholicized. The large parts of India got converted. So again, several of that has happened, particularly with the large monotheistic faiths. So that is another problem. Then, and that construct of colonization, of what is health, what is good for health, what is good for sanitation, when you read the origins of public health, a lot of Christian theology is built into it without our knowledge. Even constructs like human rights, fairness, good, evil, they're all built into it, and we use this language casually. Now let me come to you about certain historical challenges that religions have posed to science and possibly to health. Let's take heliocentrism. When philosophers and physicists and mathematicians proposed that the earth was not the center of the universe, but the sun was, the church fought against it. In fact, Galileo was executed because of it. He was persecuted. When the concept of zero as an independent number arose out of India, traveled to Arabia, and then came into Europe, in Rome, zero as an independent number was banned as blasphemy. People were executed for practicing zero. In Greece, zero was banned because it contradicted the teaching of Aristotle that void does not exist. Okay, so your fundamental ideas like heliocentrism and zero as a mathematical concept, which are rejected by religion. And more recently, you can find other examples. Blood transfusion is rejected by the Jehovah's Witness. During COVID, we saw objections to COVID virus as a cause of the disease, even in the United States. Vaccine hesitancy, the religious basis of it, the spread of disease, because whether it is the Kumbh Mela in India, where the Hindus millions of them were bathing, or Muslims going on pilgrimage, it didn't matter. So there was a problem there. Then more, even contemporary ideas like gay rights have been opposed by almost all religions of the world, except there are some exceptions over there. Abortions, the topic of abortion cannot be had. You cannot have a debate about abortion by ignoring the sentiments of it. Why is it 45% or 47% of Americans today do not agree with abortion as a right? Again, it goes back to certain religious traditions. And then the other problem about religion and health is religion has historically, on the one hand it might empower people, but on the other hand it has, contributed to a feeling of fatalism. It's God's will, and therefore I shall accept my cancer, or therefore I shall accept all my illness. We've had witches who have been burned in Salem, because of religious ideas. Mental illnesses treated with exorcism, happening in many cultures. So there's been a lot of difficulty of promoting health because of the barriers of religion and religious beliefs. And I am not going to talk too much about the historical conflicts, in wars that religion has caused, crusades, some of the early Islamic invasions, things like, even now, the conflict in between Israel and Palestine, there are fundamental underlying religious tensions going on here. So you can't ignore it. So when you think of two ideas, two arguments, very reasonable people on two sides, supporting each other, their own versions. But when you go back to it, the roots are often in religion. So religion has played a major role here. Now, having said all this, I want to agree with you that religion is a reality. There is something about humans which has made us invent religion. I don't know why. If you read Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, mythology and myth was a way in which we promoted a culture of flexible cooperation. That's how it all started. So we needed some myths. And religion was a kind of myths that we invented. Different groups of people invented different myths. And even neurobiologically, people have studied neurobiology and said there is some reason why we need religion or beliefs in our head. Without that, we don't survive as humans. So that has always happened. So I think there are reasons. And socioculturally, religion has always played a role. So all of this means that there is something about the human construct or the human being or just whatever, that religion is a necessary part. Whether it is right or not, I don't know. But some belief is a necessary part, and that belief is manifest in the form of religion. my question really is, how can we harness public health, harness religion to advance public health? And my experience here has been extremely limited. For example, here in Georgia, in North Georgia, we had a church-based, randomized controlled trial where we tried to promote lifestyle intervention using the structure of churches and using the credible voices of the priests to advance it. So that's what we did, and it seemed to work. So that's one idea. There have been studies suggesting that people who are religious tend to be healthier, and I think those data, to me, are not entirely convincing because we don't know how that is operating. Is it because of the people just socially getting together, or is it because of people? We don't know. People who are religious tend to, are more obedient in terms of following certain healthy ways. I don't know. Or is it like what Bertrand Russell might quip? The fact that somebody who's religious is happier is no more to the point than a drunk is happier than a sober person. I don't know. So finally, I agree with you on that final point, that we are in an era of secularization. I do not believe secularization is going to displace religions altogether. In fact, when you start examining secularization in secular societies, which are operating in vacuum of religion, secularism itself is becoming another kind of religion. I mean, let's ask questions. Concepts like human rights, democracy, equity, they are belief-based. They're all belief-based. And the people who are dogmatically adhering to it, particularly in absolute terms or in very dogmatic terms, can get just as uptight about it, get just as uncompromising about it. And yet, each of this, there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs to freedom versus central authority. There are freedoms to human rights versus personal safety, and we're not ready to acknowledge it. So what I'm trying to conclude here is, for some reason, the human mind or the human mind is curious, and we've invented science as a way of advancing curiosity. And science has delivered tremendous human good, tremendous progress in technology, tremendous progress, and yet we are also stuck with this idea of requiring a belief structure to hold us, stable at some point, as to give us meaning. So, so essentially, how do we reconcile the two? I don't have an answer. My own answer is very simple. I believe as long as you're curious, as long as you have compassion for fellow human being, not empathy, compassion for fellow human being. And thirdly, as long as you have a sense of romance, that's all you need. With that,
Thank you, Dr. Owens. So I'm going to respond briefly to the points Venkat just made, just as he responded to mine, and give you a chance to weigh in as well. And then we'll open it up for further discussion. Venkat was speaking more extemporaneously, so this was the first time I heard him lay out the 4 points that he wanted to make. So here are my kind of off-the-cuff quick responses. I agree with you in the idea of the field of intellectual inquiry between religion and science as having aspects of inquiry that allows for uncertainty versus a kind of articulation of propositions or truths predicated on an idea of certainty. I would argue that actually in practice, the function of scientific method and religious practice turn those kind of upside down. This isn't my own thought, this is the thought of a French sociologist and cultural theorist, Bruno Latour, who is a philosopher of science around how religion and science work. I would argue that when we actually think about not the articulation of a research aim or a conceptual framework that guides our studies, but when we actually practice it, that a lot of scientific inquiry is predicated on a certain kind of orthodoxy that makes it very difficult to challenge. So while hypothetically or conceptually, we're open to the disproving of a hypothesis, in reality, from the point of view of kind of received evidence to the reality of trying to engage innovation in an R21 grant proposal to the NIH, there are frameworks that set certain conditions that purport to be open to scientific inquiry and skepticism, but actually reinforce this kind of sense of certainty or dogma that's not based on a kind of proposition to a divine power or the existence of God, but to the weight of scientific data. I think you can see that the example that comes to mind historically really powerfully is the way in which John Snow was just raked over the coals when he proposed that there was something being transmitted in the cholera outbreak of London in the mid-1800s that wasn't due to miasma and bad air. And there was a refusal to look at new evidence and new data. Now that's true definitely of religious traditions. I've run up against that in my own life in regard to my own Christian tradition, especially in relation to my sexuality, but also in aspect to other experiences in my life. So I'm not disagreeing with you in regard to that. I do think that there are elements and aspects of religious traditions that have staying power, that have some way of engaging the question of authority and how you question authority intrinsic to the traditions themselves. So I would only say that robust religious traditions have some process of engaging questions and expressing skepticism intrinsic to their own traditions and raising questions about those traditions. I'm glad that you said we need to define religion. I agree. I think there's a lot of talk in the United States today, especially about being spiritual but not religious. I'm not always sure what that means. I think that I think it's really important that we understand the social force of religion in regard to its organizational structure, because it's at that level that it impacts populations and societies and not only individual spiritual practices. And that's one aspect and element of why I think it's really important to define religion. I agree that when we talk about religion, especially in the United States, we're talking really about the Abrahamic traditions and especially about Christianity. So we don't conceptualize religion in the cultural context of places like Emory or in the United States more broadly around the diversity of religious expressions around the world. In that regard, we don't really understand the contextuality of what we're talking about when we're trying to define religion. You raised some critical questions about the experience or the concern you have about religious actors in the health space or in the services, human services space, proselytizing as a precondition of their services. I certainly know that happens, but in my experience, that's actually not very common. It may have been common. It was certainly an instrument and a vehicle for colonization beginning 400 years ago, and was common especially up into the late 1800s. But at least out of North American and European context, religious institutions had this debate over a century ago and settled it that religious motivation was the driver of the provision of health services as an end unto themselves and not as an instrument or vehicle for conversion into that religious tradition. And I work a lot with faith-based organizations providing health services across the continent of Africa especially, but also in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I don't know of anyone that predicates an articulation of belief as a precondition for receiving services, or even brings up that issue in relation to services. To the extent that it would happen, I would disagree with it and I would critique it from the perspective of the vitality of a religious tradition and just as bad practice. And then finally, I'm really glad that you actually said a point that I think is an important one to acknowledge. I would argue, in echoing you, Venkat, that it's almost impossible to think about the practice of global health in 2024 outside of institutions and structures that have their origin and their basis in American Protestant Christianity. John D. Rockefeller, the world's richest man who on a per capita basis a century ago had 3 times the wealth of Bill Gates, think about that, was motivated by a very specific blending of American Protestant Christianity and capitalism as he articulated and was a champion for a movement known as the social gospel. The founding of the League of Nations Health Organization and then eventually the World Health Organization of the United Nations was predicated on Rockefeller dollars. The missionary impulses that the Rockefeller Foundation carried out and the programs that they supported in China, in other parts of East Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, set the foundations for the founding of the study of public health in many institutions around the world, including Harvard, the London School, and the University of Michigan. So I agree with you in those ways. The land that Rockefeller gave, both in New York City, is the land on which the Secretariat building of the United Nations is built, and that he endowed and paid for in Geneva, on which both the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the World Council of Churches have their headquarters, is predicated on this particular vision of what he saw as the Christian tradition. If you're ever in Geneva, walk past the cathedral and go to the main city public park and look at the vast statues of the Protestant reformers that occupy the space in that park. It is impossible to think about the political mission of the United Nations family of organizations in Geneva without thinking about that kind of tradition, at least historically. Today I would say they've been pulled apart, but there are very strong connections there. So if we want to think about public health practice and global health practice within the structures and institutions with which we carry this work out, the ways in which a very specific American brand of Christian Protestantism enlivened that, imagine what it would look like, and provided the funding for it to happen, is inextricably linked to what we're all doing in the field of global health today. We don't have to accept that. We can try to challenge it and create new structures. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. And I would agree with you in regard to, in many ways, in which Christianity is built into global health. Finally, I think what I'd say, Venkat, is one of the things that came to me, and you may take issue with this framing, and so I frame it respectfully, but I'm also open to hearing your critique. I've come to think of you from today as a really passionate, spiritual skeptic. And I don't mean that you're skeptical of spirituality, but that skepticism in itself is a practice of you getting to mystery and questions and to turning over and articulating the critique of, well, this is the way it's happened before, but it shouldn't happen that way and it needs to happen in another way. That your skepticism is, to me, a practice that connects you to the what if and the possibility. In that way, I would say the kind of aspects of that from my perspective, and you may say I'm putting this on you, and that's perfectly fine, I'll listen to that. But it is in that way a dimension of what I would say, even if you wouldn't, of a spiritual practice of asking questions and being open to mystery. The Christian tradition has a tradition known as negative theology, of articulating what the tradition cannot say fully about the nature of reality and questions within that reality. And in some ways, you seem to me to be a kind of quintessential negative theologian. So, questions or comments?
Okay, I'll just be very quick. Thank you very much. I'll accept any description. I just want to make a few points, John, if I may. Firstly, this notion that religions or religious structures help the marginalized. It may be true, but again, when you study history, there's a phenomenon you can unravel from history, is that throughout history, whether it was the French Revolution, whether what's going on in Pakistan or what's going on, whatever, in India, whatever, there has been a kind of strong collaboration between the ruling class, the secular powers, the theological powers, okay, the priests, and the rich people in that society, whether it is the aristocracy in France, the kings in France, and the church, or it's the mullahs in Pakistan, the zamindars, and the military. So there has been so they are much more interested in preserving of the power, and religions and spiritual powers have often given legitimacy to the secular powers. That's how it has always worked, and I think we can't Okay, number one. So that's one point I want to challenge you on. And secondly, about this thing that proselytization has disappeared, about the American brand of Protestantism is not doing it. You just need to visit Africa. Several parts of Africa, the Christian evangelists from here are seeking refuge in those countries and are promoting laws to execute gays. It's happening there. I was shocked. I was in the lounge at Frankfurt Airport. Sitting next to me was an American evangelist and a Kerala priest on their way to India, and they shared with me their atlas of where there are unconverted populations and what the price per conversion is. They've done cost-effectiveness studies of this. Okay, so that still exists. So let's not overlook it. Then again, the issue of it's not necessarily belief in God alone that causes the problem. I mean, Buddhism is a classic example, a very large atheistic faith. Jainism is an atheistic faith, but Buddhism and one could argue Marxism is a kind of faith too. But when you look at the problems that Maoism caused in China, or the problem that certain Buddhism has caused in places like parts of Sri Lanka and parts of Burma, in Myanmar, what it means is when you combine organization with myth, it's a dangerous combination. And that is why the way to avoid myth, and that's the redemption science provides. It's a kind of a check against mythology. It forces you to think and question. The problem is, in public health, we have two problems. Number one, we rely on the science of sciences to give us what to do, but then we are an organized force. I mean, you can describe public health as nothing else than organized delivery of health. It's a system of organization. So we have borrowed the organizational principles of religion on the one hand, and we have combined it with the science of knowledge, and we want to generate it. And the problem is, this is why we periodically need to stop and say, listen, let's not get carried away by public health, because sometimes when you over-organize a system, you fall into the myths that the system carries with it, and you're unable to question it. I mean, like, for example, yesterday, vaccine, refuses across the world. It must be because of fake news. But when you look across the world, the proportion of vaccine refusers is constant in all free countries in the world. There's about 12 to 14% in the world. So why is it? Is it something else? We don't know. So I think there is that problem too. So I feel, finally, all I can say is, in the final conclusion, I think science, whether we like it or not, in the last several hundred years, has given tremendous progress to humanity. Tremendous progress. It's made possible things that we could never have made possible, science and technology. At the same time, religion may provide people with purpose. I would not oppose to religion in ways I would have done 20, 30 years ago. I think it exists. But what is required is an acceptance of religious pluralism and a guardrail against organized religion becoming evil. So that's what I would appeal for.
Thanks. Let me just quickly respond to your response, and then we'll open it up. I spoke imprecisely, and thank you for clarifying and for raising the critique around proselytization. I had thought when I heard you that you were speaking about connecting like the provision of health or educational services to conversion for those who are provided by facilities. I'm not aware that happens in any great number, doing a lot of work with faith actors on the continent. That said, the kind of expression of what you're talking about of the role of religious leaders from the United States, for example, coming into various national and social contexts and on the continent of Africa or in India, happens all of the time in really powerful ways. I'm very critical of that. So we're on the same page about proselytization as it relates to cultural and political practices. I'm not aware of strong proselytization in the provision of health services by faith actors. I guess the last thing I would say in regard to the issue of agency and power in regard to marginalization or power of religion as it's tied to the political and cultural center and kind of power sources is religion can be in either place, and it is in both places. Religion has definitely been tied to the monarchies of Europe and Christendom, to governmental and political structures in present-day theocracies in various parts of the world, and to the White House and the Congress. That's just a fact. It's a fact that we need to be critical of in terms of analyzing power. What I would say is that we have to critique power in its institutional expression wherever it resides and not say that religion occupies this distinctive space alone. Public health can also exercise power in collaboration with government in ways that might actually be detrimental to health outcomes and practices. I think of the Ebola response in West Africa in 2015, in which the public health response to the outbreak was to forego religious practices related to the handling of the dead because of the transmission of Ebola from one person to another through those practices. There was no consideration about the intrinsic inherent cultural value and priority that those practices reflected and demonstrated in the lives of local communities. And maybe from a perspective of evidence and epidemiology, you would say we shouldn't include that perspective in that point of view. In terms of saving lives, it was only when we modified the public health guidance in regard to the handling of bodies in a safe and dignified way that allowed both for religious expression and a minimization of transmission of Ebola from one person to another through those practices that we saw the incident rates of new cases go down. And there are lots of ways in which public health also connects itself into structures of power in political and cultural spaces, and we need to critique that. I think there's always an important question about what marginalization looks like and what practices occur on the margins and how we critically engage in the midst of that. I certainly do it in regard to religion myself. I think we also need to do it in the practice of public health. We'll open it up now for, Venkat, if you'll join me up front, and thank you for this. We'll now open it up for questions or comments from others in the
John, can you hear on the Zoom?
I can, Jim.
Okay, maybe just turn off the share so that you can see who's there. And I have a question, but others in the room may want to go first.
Just go.
Jump in.
Jump in, Jim.
Okay,
I'm ready.
yeah, well, I'll start off then. First of all, just congratulations, guys, for doing this. I mean, it's a really, I thought it was a really, really thoughtful exchange of views. So I really appreciate that. I want to make just a couple of observations, maybe just get you guys to comment. One, Venkat, you talked about this kind of presumption in religion of the existence of God. And I think that's kind of generally understood to be true, but I mean, I was brought up as a Catholic, and it was very, very clear, certainly in Catholic theology, that faith was the cornerstone of the theological tradition, and that faith, if there was no confusion about the existence of God, you wouldn't need faith. So I think that people accept that you're just supposed to believe in God, but I think in the deeper theology often is more about this grappling with the mystery. So that's kind of point one. The second, Venkat, you also talked about religion rejecting a lot of progress. John picked up on this a little bit. I think, and the John Snow examples from a little while ago, but I think about Tachi Yamada's piece in the New England Journal about, Robin Warren and Barry Marshall and their Nobel Prize in 2005 and how they were absolutely vilified. They lost their jobs. They were marginalized in the scientific community because of their proposition that maybe ulcers were caused by H. pylori. So I think that the rejection of progress is also very much an inherent feature in science as well. And there's a lot of orthodoxy in doctrine and indoctrination in science. And I guess the observation I want to make is that it seems to me, and I think what you guys are bringing to the surface really, really nicely, is it's more about this uncritical acceptance of the doctrine and the lack of humility. I think that where the problems arise, right? I think if as soon as we fall into being trapped too much in the orthodoxy, that's where the problems seem to happen. So the final point, if I may, because I just found this super, super interesting. One of the sort of features of evidence as we think about the nature of the knowledge that we create and the way that it functions as evidence, is that it's sort of cumulative, but also defeasible. And And in science, this is kind of baked in, even if we're not very good at it sometimes. We're pretty orthodox. We like to believe in our findings, but it is baked in that there's really nothing sacred in science. We can be looking at, general relativity and still question whether or not it's the right kind of theory. So there's a kind of defeasibility of the evidence that we generate or the knowledge that's baked into science. I feel like that part, John, in religion is really where you run into kind of stumbling points. It may very well be that you can say in theology we're supposed to have faith because we can't really know for sure whether God exists. But this notion that we may be able to make progress towards defeating that understanding seems to be a kind of non-starter in religion. So sorry that was a lot. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting stuff. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Thanks, Jim. Let's talk about that last point away from here, because I would say there are actually religious traditions that engage that question in a more robust and intentional and thoroughgoing way than what you just characterized there. But we can talk about that outside of here. Thank you for your comment.
Great, thanks.
Others?
Question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess reflecting on your experience as a chaplain and now as a researcher, like how has your work in terms of engaging with religious leaders or just engaging with religion in general, how has that changed? And are you seeing, are we doing better? I don't know. I don't know how things have been. I know we're making a lot of effort into, especially in HIV, trying to bring religious leaders, but can you kind of just talk about your experience and how that engagement has
Sure.
evolved
Well,
over time?
to just, what I'm about to say is going to be reflective of what you already know about me, because you were a TA in my course in religion and HIV. I don't have a lot of energy around adhering to or undergirding religious dogma and orthodoxy. My own religious life and being kicked out of a religious tradition makes that impossible, and I don't want to put any effort in that regard. In that way, I'm really aware of the dangers of what Venkat has just talked about and described. That said, I don't think it's the right way, either tactically and strategically or from the perspective of kind of cultural humility and awareness, engaging in any kind of cultural context here in the United States or in other parts of the world, to simply dismiss religion as superstition. That there has to be a respectful engagement, that people hold it and hold the space of the religious in their own lives in really important and central ways. It's formative to who they are as individuals, as families, as communities, as cultures. And we have to do a better job of acknowledging that space, especially for those of us who are skeptical about religion, I would argue. The other thing that's really important for us to do is to not assume that public health is culturally neutral. Public health is only intelligible if we think about the cultural structures and presuppositions that make it possible to carry out what we are talking about. So in that way, it's not a neutrality engaging a certain kind of subjectivity that's religious when we meet the religious other somewhere in the world. It's our subjectivity that privileges and values all of what we talk about within this field, engaging with the subjectivity of another person. And whenever that happens, power is at play. And so the dangers of unexamined power in that space are that religion can overrun lots of things in that way, but so can we. And that's what I think it's really important for us to interrogate, given that we're going to other parts of the world to carry out initiatives in their spaces and in their homes.
Yeah, Jitin?
I think both will agree some wonderful points. I think the only thing which I feel may have missed is the concept of morals and moral foundations in terms of who is an active participant in religion versus who is an active participant in science. Despite his many critiques, Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work on this, and I wish Bob was here to talk more about it. But that said, I feel religion is very good about defining an outgroup, while science, fundamentally, there should not be any outgroup. And it's great for somebody who has liberal or libertarian tendencies, wherein anybody should be able to raise any point which might be, and anything is subject to question. But that said, I feel we are in the danger of sort of what Venkat was saying, of certain scientific concepts becoming dogmas, especially around like solutions. Like, so AI is a solution for something, biotech is a solution for everything, solving SDOH will solve everything. So I feel those kind of dogmatic practices are coming into science, but I think that's also driven by people who come into science from more of like a religious or not self-critical or non-critical backgrounds. So I just like, I want Venkat to talk about this. Like, if it's possible to, where do dogmas in science come from, and is it just a function of certain models? And John, you may also have like thoughts on that.
Okay, couple of them, and I just want to expand on your first point. I mean, I'm just thinking as I'm trying to answer the question. Firstly, in terms of models, I mean, I want to pose to you the question as whether models should be explicitly and externally defined, or as humans, there is an innate model structure that we have. Because again, when you think of evolution, survival depends on both competition and on cooperation. All along it has. And depending on which is important, the species or the organism has adjusted to it. So there is actually a beautiful book called The Moral Animal, Humans the Moral Animal. I think it was Robert Kaplan, I think was the author. So he basically argues that it is innate. The idea of cooperation is innate, the idea of competition is innate, and the balance, there is an invisible hand that operates the balance. You don't need to have a protocol to do it. So I would argue whether that is a theory worth examining, and whether by imposing, externally explicit values onto models, are we messing up the whole thing? That is one thing I want to ask you.
I couldn't believe you brought up morality to think how that's for our first debate.
Okay.
No. Okay, and the second point is, even if say those are necessary, is it the idea that those models should be implemented through myths? I mean, like one of the famous things that sticks in my head from Yuval Harari's book, The Sapiens, is you cannot promise. A monkey is not going to wait. If you tell a monkey either eat a banana now or 100 bananas in monkey heaven, the monkey is going to eat that one banana now. Whereas with humans, we're able to forego, sacrifice our hedonism or our pleasure for things and do cruelty because there is place for us in heaven, or we don't want to avoid hell. So we are actually creating problems, greater problems, which I would question whether A, the need for external morality, and B, the imposition of such morality through mythology is something that I would question. Now, coming to science and dogma, science is also a human endeavor. You can't deny it. Science it's got all the positive human endeavors. So there have been studies, or the great scientists study Isaac Newton. He was horrendous when it came to competition. There were people who hated this. Fake, there's loss and lack of integrity in science, all of that happens. And try to convince the large part of the US diabetologists that insulin resistance is less important than insulin secretion. It's difficult, orthodoxy exists. But the saving grace for science is it allows the skeptic and the heretic a greater level of freedom. And also, science is willing to adjust its assumptions. Like, for example, even questions like, is time one-directional or two-directional is discussed. And if time was to be proven to be two-dimensional, science will adapt to it. I think that way, science is a more flexible, intellectual, mental kind of thing, because it's free of reward or punishment at the end, in the afterlife. That's where the difference is.
I am aware that we're out of time. It's 4 minutes until 1, and some of you probably have class in 4 minutes and may need to go to another building. I want to thank every one of you for coming. I want to thank you especially, my friend, for being on this discussion today. And I'm happy to continue talking a little bit more informally, but let's adjourn formally. And if you want to stick around and ask further questions, feel free to come on up and we'll hang out for a little bit longer. Thank you all. Thanks for those who joined online.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, guys.